Are you looking for ways to strengthen your marriage? Would you like to raise children you enjoy being around? Do you long for a peaceful, orderly home that's a blessing to everyone who comes through its doors? Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jennifer Flanders, a Bible-believing, homeschooling mother to 12 and host of the Loving Life at Home podcast. Join me as we discover what God's Word has to say about marriage, motherhood, and minding the things that matter most.
Hello, friend. Welcome to episode 75 of Loving Life at Home. Today, I'd like to discuss something that is very important to marital happiness, and that is learning to emphasize your spouse's good points. But before we get into it, I'd like to give you a pop quiz. Which would you prefer? A, that your husband focus his thoughts on your loveliest, most noble, and praiseworthy characteristics? Or B, that he ignore your good points completely and concentrate instead on your most annoying and bothersome flaws? Well, that's a pretty easy one for me. And I would suggest that we would do for our husbands as we'd have them do for us. So learn to emphasize your husband's good qualities. Think about what attracted you to your husband in the first place. Express verbal admiration for those things. In what areas has he grown and matured since he met? Let him know that you've noticed and appreciate the progress. What things would you miss if he were gone? Thank him for everything he does for you and your family, and never take him for granted. Live each day as if it were your last. Dwelling on the positive isn't so hard, especially when you consider that every negative behavior can sometimes stem from positive traits. Trace them back to their source. I've talked about this before, and I'll link up the episode in the show notes. I think it was called You Find What You Look For. A case in point is when I was first married to my husband, it often bothered me that he would make what I considered frivolous and impulsive purchases. Back then, it was sodas and candy at the corner gas station. Later on, it would be new cars and cutting-edge technologies. But I eventually came to recognize the fact that my husband's spending habits go hand in hand with his giving habits. Figuratively, since he views money as a tool, not as a treasure to be clutched or loved or hoarded, but also literally, because he usually gives away to some grateful person in need whatever good as new thing he is upgrading or replacing. If it weren't for people like him, people like me would never find anything worth having at Goodwill and thrift shops. But that lavish generosity, that willingness to show God's blessings to those around him, that ability to give cheerfully, hilariously even, is something that is very good indeed. It is one of the traits that I admire and appreciate most about my husband. And now I'm reminded of that fact every time he buys something that I think he shouldn't. It's okay for us to be different. His strengths are not my strengths and vice versa. Much of this is by design, as God intends for man and woman to complement each other. Different is not necessarily bad. It's just different. So don't focus on the areas where you are strong but your husband is weak. Areas when, in your opinion, perhaps he doesn't quite measure up. Such a focus will only lead to contempt and bitterness and resentment, which will deal a death blow to your love and intimacy, if not to your marriage itself. Think instead on the areas where you are weak but your husband is strong, areas where he complements and completes you. I love the quote by Judas Cabral that says, "The more you point out someone else's flaws, the more you emphasize your own." Certainly, your husband is flawed. He is a sinner. In the words of Elizabeth Elliot, there isn't anything else to marry. Not for you and not for him either, because he married a sinner as well. But beyond praying for him, the fact must not be your focus. I've been reading a book lately by Gary Chapman called Love is a Verb. And to be honest with you, it is not what I was expecting. He is the same author that wrote The 5 Love Languages, and I expected this to be kind of a marriage book about the importance of love with his particular spin on it. But instead, it really reminds me a little bit more of Chicken Soup for the Soul. It's just stories that his readers have sent in, not just of the love that they have for their spouse, but the love that they have for neighbors and children and siblings and friends and strangers, and how God has grown that ability to look at the world through his eyes of love in each of these people. And then, of course, Gary Chapman just weaves all of these letters together and into this book. So I've really enjoyed hearing all these perspectives, and it's been a good reminder of the importance of cultivating a loving heart towards others, but especially for the people that share your home and the one that shares your bed every night, which is your spouse. One of the stories in particular that stood out to me was written in by a wife who found herself becoming repeatedly annoyed by her husband's habit of drinking his chocolate milk with a spoon. He would just sit in his easy chair and clink, 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 clink. She would hear it over and over again as he would sip his chocolate milk with this spoon. She admitted that he was a little bit overweight and that if he were to drink the milk, he could guzzle hundreds of calories in a single sitting. So he would use the spoon as a way of controlling his portions. But it was really becoming very annoying to her, and one night she could hardly think about anything else except the fact that he was driving her crazy, clinking his spoon on the edge of his glass as he had his chocolate milk treat before bed. And so she got up and went into the kitchen and decided she would just make a list of all his most bothersome flaws. And she did. And she thought of 3 or 4, maybe 5 things, and then looked over the list and thought, that's not very many. I think I'll make a list of all his good traits. And she started writing and writing and writing and writing and ended up with, I think, 3 full pages of qualities in her husband that she admired. And she thought, wow, those really outweigh the things that annoy me. I wonder how I'd fare with that. So she made a list of her good qualities and realized her husband had a lot more good qualities than she did. So she got out another piece of paper and decided to make a list of her own flaws. And she wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote some more and still didn't exhaust them all. And her conclusion after this little exercise is, I don't know why my husband stays married to me. And so it went from being annoyed at him to being convicted of her own struggles and sin and annoying habits that she knows must bother him. And so what she did was she tore up the list of those 5 things that bothered her about him and threw it into the fire that night and just burned it up. And she folded her list of things that she really admired about her husband in half and tucked it in her purse and then would read it. I think she read it several times a day for the first few weeks and then once a week for several months thereafter until they were really solidly set in her mind. And then she said she's reminded every time she changes purses because that list is still for her to peruse. And then she took her own list of things that she knew she needed to work on and came up with a strategy to tackle those areas of struggle in her own life. And she said she never breathed a word of this exercise to her husband, but within a few days he had started noticing the change within his wife and her attitude towards him. And he also, without any explanation, stopped drinking his chocolate milk with a spoon. So she didn't even have to deal with that annoyance anymore as a result of focusing on her husband's good qualities. So look for good in your spouse. Search for it as you would search for buried treasure, and keep those traits at the forefront of your mind. Philippians 4:8 tells us, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of a good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Some versions translate that dwell on these things or focus on these things. And that should certainly be the case for us in marriage. We want to keep those traits at the forefront of our mind, even if it means keeping that list in a handy spot and reviewing it regularly, daily if needed, and multiple times a day if needed. So look for the good in your spouse. Search for it as you would search for buried treasure, and keep those traits at the forefront of your mind. If focusing on the positive has been a struggle for you in the past, pray that God will help you see your husband with new eyes. Pray that he would open your eyes to the things that your husband does well, and that he would help you to affirm him in those areas. Praise and admire your spouse verbally and often. Are you glad that God brought him into your life? Tell him so. Would you feel you were missing out without him? Let him know it. Emphasize his good points in your thoughts and in your speech, and you will see more of the same flourish in his character, his life, and his manner.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you have a question you'd like to hear covered on this podcast, message me on Instagram at Flanders_family or contact me through my website, lovinglifeathome.com. Before you go, if you've been encouraged by something you've heard on the show, do me a favor and forward the link to a friend or head over to Loving Life at Home on Apple iTunes to subscribe and leave a written review of the show. Your doing so will help others find me so they can listen too. Until next time, I pray the Lord will bless your efforts to build a loving home life centered on Him.